Good morning, everybody. Welcome to MSU and Sparrow Pediatric Grand Rounds. I would also like to extend a warm welcome to our colleagues in Flint and Grand Rapids. Before we get started, I have a couple of announcements. Today at subspecialty rounds, Drs. Kidwell and Burke will do a PQ case presentation. Please join us next week when Drs. Ann Liebert and Steve Martin will present pediatric morbidity and mortality. I'm now going to invite Dr. English up to introduce this morning's speaker.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Grand Rounds. It's my pleasure today to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Fred Rivara, as our visiting Grand Round speaker. Dr. Rivara earned his undergraduate degree with highest honors at the College of Holy Cross, his medical degree at the University of Pennsylvania, and then he trained in pediatrics at both the Children's Hospital in Boston and in Seattle Children's Hospital, where he was a Robert Wood Johnson scholar and earned his master's in public health. He sojourned for 3 years in the great state of Tennessee, where I was later, but we missed each other by a few years when he was in Memphis and at LeBonham Children's Hospital in general pediatrics. But then he was recruited back to Seattle, where he has spent the rest of his career. Fred has been really a pioneer in the field of injury prevention and injury prevention research. He's got over 600 peer-reviewed publications, written textbook chapters and books about this topic. Started back early in his career, and he's had this focus for that time. He was the founding director of the Harborview Injury Prevention Research Center, I think the leading such center in the world, in Seattle. And he's been involved with all sorts of injury prevention research over the years. He's previously the editor of JAMA Pediatrics and now the editor of JAMA Open Network. As I mentioned, he was the founding director of the Injury Prevention Center in Seattle, and he's won many awards, both in the injury prevention field and in pediatrics. The Charles Shepard Awards from the CDC, the awards from the American Public Health Association, from the AAP, and from University of Washington. And one of the awards that I think he's probably particularly happy about winning was the Stanley Stem House Staff Role Model Award from the pediatric residents at the University of Washington. He was also the keynote speaker at my daughter's white coat ceremony in Memphis when she enrolled in medical school. And so that was a very important time for me personally. He was elected to the Institute of Medicine in 2005, and today he's going to talk about a topic that unfortunately is sadly relevant once again today in the United States and around the world, and that's firearm violence and its prevention. Fred, thanks for coming. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Keith, for the chance to speak with you all here. This was the cover of Time magazine this week. Many of you have probably seen it. It's actually a pretty cool cover. If you go online, it's an interactive cover, and you can see a lot of different people here. Here's Gabby Gifford. Here's some people that are in gun shooting club. Here's a trauma surgeon over here. And it really, I think, depicts the broad spectrum of opinions about firearms. The shooting last night in California could have happened here in East Lansing. Bunch of college kids going out and having a good time. Unfortunately, those episodes are really increasingly common, it seems. What I want to try to do today is to give you information. I think this is a topic that we all should be well informed about. There are things that we can do as physicians, as pediatricians, and as members of our community. And I hope that you take away some ideas of how you can make a difference in your community. I think this encapsulates pretty well the magnitude of the problem, that there are more people that have died in the last 45 years on the nation's homes and streets from firearms than have died in all of our wars combined, which is pretty remarkable. We talk a lot about terrorism, and you can see that the number of people who died from firearms in our country is far, far more than the number who die each year from terrorist attacks. Let's pause for a second before we talk more about firearm injuries, and let's talk about the success story for motor vehicle crashes. This blue line shows the number of miles driven in the United States over the last century, and this is the death rate per billion miles traveled. And you can see that there's been a remarkable 95% reduction in the number of fatalities per mile driven over the last 100 years. It's a combination of a lot of factors. Trauma care is certainly much better now than it was at the turn of the century. But for the most part, it's really been the motor vehicles which have become safer and the roads which have become safer. And this is some of the background that was responsible for this remarkable decrease in motor vehicle deaths. Ralph Nader, before he screwed up the 2000 election, actually did some good. He wrote a book published in 1965 called Unsafe at Any Speed. It's about the Chevy Corvair, which was an incredibly dangerous car. And that really created some groundswell to try to make motor vehicles safer. President Johnson, the next year, created the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, which is the organization in the government that oversees motor vehicle safety, creates regulations about motor vehicle safety, tracks motor vehicle crashes, both fatal and non-fatal. And you can see a series of regulations that they've published. Front seat belts, collapsible steering wheels. 1979, they started doing motor vehicle crash tests. 1978 was the first car seat law in the United States. It was passed at the advocacy of Bob Sanders, who was a pediatrician in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. 1984, the first seatbelt law in the United States and New York. Driver airbags weren't required until 1989, although technology existed from the 60s. Here in Michigan, the motor vehicle manufacturers strongly resisted putting in airbags, but then they realized that it didn't cost a whole lot and really could provide a lot of protection. 93, side impact regulation, motor vehicle crash standards. Event data recorders, just like you probably don't realize, but your car has a black box, just like airplanes do. So if there's a crash, that information on the black box can be downloaded and provide information about how fast you were going, whether or not you were wearing seatbelts, whether or not you applied the brakes before the crash. And all states except New Hampshire, which has the motto, live free or die, now have seatbelt laws. In contrast, there are many, many gaps in our policy around firearms. How that happened. Unlike motor vehicles, there really is no licensing for the most part of gun owners. There's no registration of firearms. And in fact, because of an act in the 1980s, there's specifically a federal law which prevented any kind of database on guns. So don't really know how many firearms there are in the United States. There's no national database. Unlike motor vehicles, where there is a national database on motor vehicle fatalities, there's no national database of firearm injuries or fatalities. There's very few regulations on gun designs and few regulations on required safety features. Spent a little time on the CDC website and put together this slide. And you can see that around about 2007, 2008, the lines crossed. So now there are more firearm fatalities in the state of Michigan than there are motor vehicle fatalities, which is really pretty remarkable. And you can see here, there's actually been an uptick in both. I think this uptick in motor vehicle fatalities, we all know, is due to cell phones and distracted driving. For firearm fatalities, it's unclear why there has been this increase in fatalities over the last few years, but certainly the important point to take away is that there are now more firearm fatalities than motor vehicle fatalities. Now, when you talk about firearms, it's really important to sort of disaggregate the problem. And with the news this morning, we think first about the homicides. Clearly an important problem, but you can see that what's really makes up the majority of firearm deaths are actually suicides. 59% nationally of firearm deaths are suicides. In the state of Washington, it's like 75% of firearm deaths are suicides. As pediatricians, we think a lot about this red slice, the unintentional injuries. The 8-year-old boy is going over to a friend's house, they find dad's gun, play around with it, and it goes off and one of them gets shot and killed. It's actually quite a small number. We also hear a lot about this number here, the black slice, which are the legal interventions, police killing citizens. This number from the CDC is clearly a underestimate. The Washington Post and the Guardian both have maintained databases looking at police shootings, and it's estimated that it's probably twice this number, probably more like about 1,000 a year. And then there are a few where the medical examiner declares them undetermined. So let's go through these individually and try to disaggregate the problem, better understand what's going on. So thinking first about homicides. Some important questions. Are we a more violent country than other countries around the world? And how does the homicide rate vary with gun ownership? And specifically, does having access to a gun increase the risk of violent death? So are we a more violent country than other countries of the world? You can see from this slide is not really. I don't know what's going on in Scotland, but you can see that we're kind of in the middle there. We're not a particularly violent country, but the Scotch whiskey? No. Tried. That's probably part of it. But you know, we're not a particularly violent country. And then I found this study here where it compared youth in Osaka, Japan to Seattle. And you can see that, if anything, kids in Seattle are less aggressive than our kids in Japan. The point of it is that we're not necessarily a more violent country. There's not a higher rate of assaults in the United States compared to other countries. But where we do differ is in the number of homicides, and specifically the red bar, the number of homicides related to firearms. You can see that compared to other high-income countries, we are far, far higher for both. When you look at Japan here, and Japan essentially has 0 firearm homicides. For the United States, you can see our rate is really quite high. In Michigan, it's significantly higher because of Detroit. And related to that is, why do we have more firearm homicides? Well, we have more firearms. Again, these are estimates because we don't really know how many guns there are in the United States, but you can see by any measure is that the United States has far, far more firearms per citizen than do other countries of the world. And here you can see in countries like Yemen, which is in the midst of a war, you know, we have more than double the number of firearms per citizen than they have in Yemen and other countries which are fairly violent. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, it's estimated, well, probably about the same number. It's estimated there's like 300 million firearms in the United States, and they're aggregated into probably 20 to 30% of the homes. And so the people that own guns usually own far more than one gun. So putting those two pieces of data together, firearm ownership and firearm deaths, you can see there's a pretty strong correlation, or of 0.8 between the two. And the United States leads the list here. Here's Japan way down here. So there really is a strong association between firearm ownership and risk of death. And then there's a study from the Global Burden of Disease folks, the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation at the University of Washington. They published all these various papers on global burden of illness. This was published this past a couple of months ago in JAMA, where they looked at the global burden of firearm injuries around the world, 1990 to 2016. You can see that in 2016, about 250,000 people died from firearms. 6 countries, of which the United States is one, accounted for 50% of the firearm deaths. In 2 countries, Brazil and the United States, accounted for a third. And then this statistic, just like the first one I showed you, that there are more firearm deaths each year than around the world than die in conflicts, except for Rwanda and the Rwanda genocide. I mean, it's really pretty remarkable here, the number of people who die from firearms compared to conflicts. And the death rates range remarkably from 0.1 in Singapore and countries like Japan to 39 in El Salvador for 100,000 people. And again, pointing out the importance of firearm suicide, which you know, with the newspapers today and the CNN today, they'll never mention firearm suicides. They really focus on homicides. But firearm suicides are an important problem. And for us as physicians, that's one of the things we really need to think about. More than a third of all the firearm suicides in the world happen in the United States. Now, firearm deaths and gun ownership, as we all know, vary widely across the country. And I just put the arrow here next to Michigan, but you can see that, you know, when I was in Tennessee, we used to say, thank God for Mississippi, because they usually have the worst health statistics. You can see countries or states like Massachusetts and Hawaii have both low rates of firearm ownership and consequently low rates of firearm deaths. But you can see that there's a pretty good straight line between the rates of firearm ownership and the rates of firearm deaths in each state. And I think this also points out, which we'll talk a little bit more later, about the importance of what happens at the state level, the importance of what happens in terms of state laws. Now, why do Americans own guns? The most common reason by far is 60% own for protection of personal safety, and about a third own for hunting. And this is really a large change in the United States over the last 50 years. 50 years ago, the NRA was mostly made up of hunters, and people owned guns for hunting. And then in the 60s, really another group kind of took over the NRA and really promoted the idea that you needed firearms for self-protection. As a result, we have self-protection is the most common reason that that people own guns. So why do people own guns then? They think that having a gun in the home is going to protect their family. It's going to decrease the risk of death in their family. So what's the data on that? So this is a study done by my colleague, Arthur Kellerman, who was also like Keith and I in Seattle and Memphis, now is the Dean of the Uniformed Services Medical School. Arthur, when he was a clinical scholar, teamed up with Don Ray, the medical examiner, and he looked at firearm ownership and gun deaths in the home in King County, Washington, where Seattle is. And they found out that, you know, there were 9 self-protection homicides, individuals killing an intruder that made their way into a home. But there were 12 unintentional injury deaths, kids playing with guns, 41 homicides, and 333 suicides. So that for every self-protection homicides, there were 43 people in the home who died. Ratio 1 to 43. To me, that's pretty stark evidence that having a gun in the home does not make your home safer. Ratio 1 to 43. 43-fold more likely somebody in your home is going to die. 37 more likely it's going to be a suicide than if you're going to shoot an intruder. Remember what happened in December 14, 2012? Newtown. The Newtown massacre. So it's an assault rifle that this individual used to kill 26 people, 20 of whom were kids. The trauma centers were not very busy. All the kids died. The next day I saw this article in the New York Times about an individual in China who stabbed 23 children and a woman at a primary school. None of the children died. Obvious reasons that firearms are much more lethal than are knives in assaults. The dues received by the NRA the next year increased fairly dramatically. And the reason was pretty clear, is that NRA members were afraid that President Obama was going to pass laws to take away their guns. So there's a surge in membership of the NRA to protect gun rights. States did pass new gun laws within the next year. Connecticut was really probably the most stringent gun law. But in 24 of those states, the laws were less restrictive, not more restrictive. And I think that before we leave the topic of homicides, it's really important to mention the racial disparities. Just looking, for example, at young males, 10 to 24 years of age, you can see the rates in Black males are dramatically higher than they are in white males or Hispanic males, dramatically higher. And it's clearly a complex issue. It has to do with poverty, it has to do with the communities in which individuals live, the absence of jobs and turning to other sources of income, substance abuse. It's a complex issue, but I think it really is important to realize that there's this enormous disparity. We talked about firearm homicides. So when you look at all this data and you put it together, what can we conclude? Well, I think that we can conclude that there is a pretty close relationship between having guns in the community and then what people who are going to commit crime use. Robbers and assailants are more likely to use guns, and therefore there's going to be more crime related to guns. And lethality of guns is much more than our other weapons. In result, we have more murders. And as I said, young African American males are disproportionately affected. What we don't know, for us as pediatricians is this: how children who have been in schools with shootings will fare in the long term. Kids that, we see them walking out of those schools with police with their hands above their heads. How does that affect them? How about the kids who just hear about school shootings in a state across the country? How does that affect how they feel about going to school the next day? How would children react to having their school teacher be armed? And it was interesting, there was in the CNN this morning, there was a talking head police officer who said that police, when they fire their weapon, hit their target only 1 out of 5 times. That's trained police officers. So you can imagine what would be the case for a school teacher who was less well trained than a police officer. How are children affected by active shooter drills? I remember growing up in elementary school, and we'd have air raid drills for nuclear bombs. I mean, they were stupid. Hide under your desk, because the nuclear bomb is going to drop on you. But we have these active shooter drills now for kids in elementary school. How does that affect kids? We don't know much about this, but this is clearly an area. I don't know if there's any child psychiatrists in the audience, but this is an area that we really need to think hard about, because our kids are being affected by this. All right, let's change now and talk about suicides. What proportion of suicides are committed with guns? How does the risk of suicide vary when guns are available or less available? And the big question that people say, well, if somebody's really intent on killing themselves, does taking away a gun really make a difference? This is looking at females, 2000 and 2016, the green bar being 2016. And you can see that the rate of suicide among women has increased over this last 16 years. It increased pretty much across the board in all ages, including among young adolescents as well as in young adults. Nationally, you can see that the number of suicides from firearms is pretty much equal to the number of suicides from non-firearms. And actually, the group at greatest risk of firearm suicides are actually white males, older males, 65 and older. Wife dies, they're left alone, they oftentimes own guns, and they commit suicide fairly frequently. So does having a gun in the home, how does that affect the risk of suicide? This is the result of a case control study that Arthur Kelman and I did back in the 90s, where we had interviewers go to homes where there had been a firearm homicide or suicide. This is the suicide data. And then they walked the neighborhood and found a control household in the next block and asked the same sorts of questions. We had fantastic research assistants who got 98% of people to talk to them. They were just remarkable. And you can see here that having a gun in the home increased the risk of suicide tenfold for young adults, sevenfold for 25 to 40-year-olds. And I think this is really what's really remarkable, is that where there had not been a history of mental illness, the risk of suicide was increased 33-fold if you had a gun in the home compared to not having a gun in the home. And it comes down to, I think a lot of it is this slide. So this was an individual who conducted a study where he interviewed people who survived a suicide attempt and asked them, how long was it between when you decided to take your life and you actually tried to do it? 24% of the attempts were done within 5 minutes, and 70% of the attempts were done within 1 hour. So it's an impulsive act. But yeah. No, I don't. The means you use to try to commit suicide really matters. So the data here on firearms are from King County, Washington, where we have, probably one of the best emergency medical services systems in the world. We have one of the leading trauma systems in the world. And yet 93% of those who try to commit suicide with a gun are going to die. We actually don't see many of those at Harborview, the trauma center, because they die in the field, compared to 2% of those who use pills. So the means you use to commit suicide matter. That's really what people talk a lot about now, is means matter. And this may be one of the most important slides of the presentation today. So this is a survival curve. You're all familiar with these, looking at, for example, cancer. And what's the probability that either at the index attempt or later, an individual is going to die from suicide? And this is followed out to 20 years afterwards. And you can see for females and males, among males, 95% of those who try to commit suicide and survive are going to be alive 20 years later. For females, it's close to 100%. So the really issue here is, what are the means that people use to try to commit suicide? If that means is not a firearm, it's a less lethal means. There's great hope that this individual will get help and be alive long term. And I think that that falls on us as physicians to make sure that that individual who's distraught doesn't have access to firearms. And let's talk a little bit about some natural experiments which show that restricting access to guns, restricting access to lethal means, may in fact result in reduction of overall suicide rates. In the UK, in the 50s and 60s, the common method of suicide was putting your head in the oven, turning on the gas. And the reason it was so successful is that you can see the carbon monoxide poisoning, carbon monoxide percentage of content of domestic gas was very high. And the reason was it was derived from coal. It's called coal gas. It had high carbon monoxide content. And then what's happened in the late 60s is that North Sea gas and oil was discovered, and it completely substituted for coal gas. And so the North Sea gas did not have a high carbon monoxide content. And this is what happened to suicide rates, male on the left, female on the right. You can see that the non-carbon monoxide suicide rate in males really stayed the same. The carbon monoxide suicide rate decreased dramatically, and as a result, there was an overall reduction in the suicide rate. In females, there is probably some substitution with other lethal means, but nevertheless, there's still an overall reduction in suicide rates. So removing a lethal means, in this case, was successful in reducing the overall rate of suicides. Here's another example. People bring up, well, what about Israel, where everyone belongs to the Israel Defense Force when they're young, and they carry the guns home with them on the weekends? Well, Israel sort of looked at that problem and said that that is a concern. And so in 2006, it required the soldiers to leave their weapons on base during the weekends. The overall suicide rates decreased by 40%. The weekend suicide rates dropped dramatically, and the weekday suicide rates didn't increase. So again, restricting access to guns in this case had a substantial effect upon suicide rates in Israel. You know, and somewhat here, this analogy to college campuses. College campuses are actually pretty safe places. And one of the reasons, I don't know what the law here is in Michigan, but in most states, you're not allowed to carry guns on college campuses. One of the first mass shootings in the United States was about 50 some odd years ago in the University of Texas in Austin, where some man went up into the clock tower with a sharpshooter rifle and shot and killed about 35 people. Guns weren't allowed on college campuses in Texas at that time. But then 50 years to the day, the governor of Texas signed into law allowing guns to be carried on college campuses. Another sort of natural experiment, Switzerland had a pretty large standing army, and they decided back here in 2003 that it needs such a big army, so they reduced the number of soldiers that they had. And here's what happened to their firearm suicide homicide rate. And you can see here for suicide rates here from firearms, they decreased dramatically. The firearm suicide rates, the non-firearm suicide rates stayed the same. So again, restricting access to lethal means in this case had a fairly large effect. What's the effect of gun laws and suicides, various gun laws? You know, there is an effect, it's not dramatic. Probably the best data come from South Dakota, where they repealed the waiting period from purchasing a handgun. And you can see that after the repeal, the rate of suicides went up by 8.9%. So state laws do matter. So putting together the data on suicides, there really is a pretty strong association between access to guns, risk of suicide, means matter. And mean restriction works because it's not a complete substitution with another lethal means. Finally, the other part of the problem is the unintentional firearm injuries. As pediatricians, want to give you a little bit of data on kids. Experiment which some folks did a number of years ago, where they took a group of 8 to 12-year-old boys and put them in groups of 2 or 3, and they had them go into a psychology laboratory, room with a one-way mirror where the investigators could watch the kids. In that room, they had a bunch of toys, but there's also a gun hidden in a sort of box of toys. You can see that 3/4 of the kids found the handgun. It's like the old story, you can't hide Christmas presents from your kids. 3/4 of those actually handled the gun. Half of those pulled the trigger. So if kids are going to find a gun, they're going to play with it and they're going to pull the trigger. And then there was another study that we published last year in JAMA Pediatrics from Brad Bushman, who's at Ohio State. He did the same sort of a study, but first what he did, he's randomized the groups into watching a 20-minute video clip. It was from, you guys probably remember this movie called The Rocket Man, or Rocketeer, I think it was. In half the clips, there was a gun violence. In the other half of the clips, there was no gun violence. 20 minutes. And then he put the kids in the same sort of a room, but there was also a hidden gun. He found out that 83% of the kids found the gun, And the kids who watched the gun violence clip pulled the trigger 22-fold more than the kids who didn't watch the gun clip. And they play with the gun 3-fold longer. 20-minute video that these kids watch. All right, so given this problem, what can we do about it? I think there are a lot of things we can do about it. I'm going to talk about a few of these. Safe storage of guns, background check policies, they do work. Preventing individuals who are high risk of harming themselves or others from owning guns. Banning assault weapons and large capacity magazines. Increasing the arrest rates for criminal shootings. Promote the development of personalized guns. And can we change the norms around gun possession? This is work from Northeastern University, Matt Miller and his group there. They did a national survey looking at gun ownership. And part of the survey here was looking at what proportion about guns in the home. So you can see that a third of households in the United States have guns in the homes where there are kids. About the same number that have guns in the homes that don't have kids in the homes. Now, among homes with guns and kids, you can see only 21% were stored, loaded, unloaded, or locked and unloaded. 50% were stored either locked and loaded or unlocked and unloaded. And 29% were stored locked and unloaded. So many of these homes are, kids are getting access to guns. Safe storage devices, there's lots of different kinds out there. There are cable locks, which are very cheap and don't really work all that well. There are trigger locks. Probably the best are the gun lock box and the gun safes. Does safe storage of firearms, does it decrease the risk of injuries to kids? And the answer is yes. This is a study done by colleague David Grossman, a case control study where he interviewed families where there had been a shooting, either accidental or suicide of a kid, and then households where there wasn't. And he showed that having the gun safely stored decreased the risk of firearm suicide or accidental shooting by 78 to 80%. So safe storage really does work. It does matter. David did another study where he went into remote Alaskan villages where guns are used all the time for subsistence hunting and protection against animals. And in half the villages, he actually gave away big gun safes that could store rifles, the other half none. And he went back to those villages a year later, and he found out that in the intervention group here, the number of guns that were unlocked was much lower than the control group. Ammunition unlocked, both unlocked. So even in this kind of a setting where guns are an important part of life, safe storage can make a difference. This is a study using the National Comorbidity Survey, the study that tells us how many people have depression, psychosis, etc. Turns out in this study, sub-study of adolescents, they also asked a question about whether there was a gun in the home and did you have access to it. And you can see that 30% of adolescents reported having a gun in the home, and almost half of those reported easy access to it. And basically what it found out is that in kids with a history of mental illness, suicidality, or substance abuse, they had as much access to guns as kids that didn't have those problems. So this is really a failure on our part, a failure on us as physicians for not identifying those kids and not making sure that they don't have access to guns. In Seattle, we had a school shooting up in Marysville, Washington, where a young man got a high school kid, junior high school, got access to a firearm, his dad's firearm. He texted his friends the day before and said, have lunch with me the next day. So there were 5 of them that were sitting around a table. He came in and shot them all before killing himself. 4 of the 5 died. One of the girls who died was the niece of one of our senior vice presidents at Children's Hospital. And that led us to then develop a safe storage program where it's funded by the hospital. We have these events at sporting goods stores like Cabela's, and we give away free lock boxes or free trigger locks. And we advertise these things on social media, and we find that people line up from 6 a.m. to get their free gun lock boxes at 10 a.m. And then what we did was we called them up 2 weeks later to see that they actually use it. And you can see here, the bottom line is that there was an increase in the number of firearms that were stored a lot, unloaded, and ammunition stored separately. So something you could do in your organization, you can do in your institutions, to try to increase the likelihood of guns being safely stored. You may have heard about Florida a number of years ago. The state passed a law that basically forbid pediatricians and other physicians from asking patients about guns. The Florida chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics sued, went back and forth for a number of years, and finally last year, the full appeals court, the 11th Circuit, threw it out and said that it violated the First Amendment rights of the pediatricians. That they have the right, we have the right to ask families about gun ownership. Different organizations look at the legislative strength of laws in each state. And simply show this, that there is a correlation between the strength of those laws and the risk of firearm deaths. As you would expect, Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi have very lax laws. Massachusetts have some of the strictest laws. And there's a pretty good relationship between the strictness of laws and the likelihood of firearm ownership. Here's Michigan kind of in the middle there. This passed 2 days ago in Washington. Our state legislature, like most legislators, won't do anything. And there was a citizens group put together called Coalition for Gun Responsibility. This is the third initiative that was passed. The first one was on universal background checks. The second was on extreme risk protection orders, where somebody can go to a judge and have a firearm removed from a home. And this one just passed, as I said, 2 days ago. One of the impetuses for this was that there was another shooting in Washington, a place called Mukilteo, 30 miles north of Seattle, where a 19-year-old went to a party of his high school mates and shot and killed like 4 people. Turns out that he went to the gun store that week and was going to buy a handgun. But of course, he was 19, he couldn't buy a handgun because you have to be 21 to buy a handgun. But you could buy an AR-15 assault rifle at age 18. So this law changed the time, the age at which you could buy that. Also instituted a waiting period, and then it strengthened the issue of that safe storage. And this passed 60 to 40 in the state of Washington Tuesday. You skipped that. Most people in the United States support stricter gun laws. You can just look at this yourself. Very few support arming teachers having metal detectors at school, but they support mandatory waiting period. They support weapons bans. They support universal background checks. We know that nothing's going to happen at the federal level, at least for a period of time. But there could be action at the state level, and that's where I urge you to get involved. Intimate partner violence, Amy Bonomi here has been very involved with this. April Zioli, who's here in the Department of Criminology, has been very involved with this. And these laws can make a difference in intimate partner-related homicides. Any state domestic violence restraining order makes a difference. Gun confiscation, there's a reduction. Violent misdemeanor laws make a difference. So state laws for things like domestic violence protection orders, extreme risk protection orders to make a difference. Smart guns, can we make guns safer? Maybe. The technology right now is pretty limited. There's only one gun on the market. It retails for $1,800. There are people on both sides of it which are not very enthusiastic about it, and it doesn't really account for the fact that there are probably 300 million guns in the United States and won't really affect that. So I don't hold up a lot of hope for that solving the problem. I want to end with the assault on science. Arthur Keller and I wrote this editorial in JAMA the week after the Newtown shootings back in 2012. You all know that. Charlton Heston, who was the Moses there, who was the president of the National Rifle Association. All of our work that Arthur and I did was published in New England Journal of Medicine. After the suicide article, well, this was after the article that came out comparing Seattle to Vancouver, British Columbia. The NRA called on their members to write the Assistant Secretary of Health about using tax dollars to conduct anti-gun pseudoscience. After the suicide paper came out, the NRA asked the feds to conduct a scientific integrity review of Arthur and myself. Fortunately, the feds declined, and that's a big deal, as we all know. After the publication of the homicide article in New England Journal, 10 senators wrote the oral inspector who passed it on to the Surgeon General and Assistant Secretary for Health, expressing concerns about saying that the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control at the CDC, their research was duplicative of that of the National Institute of Justice, which wasn't true, and that they were promoting a political agenda by funding firearm research. And they threatened to eliminate funding for the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control entirely. They didn't succeed in doing that, but they did pass something called the Dickey Amendment, you've probably heard about, in 1996. The Dickey Amendment by J. Dickey didn't actually forbid the CDC from conducting firearm research. It just simply said that no federal money can be used to lobby for gun control, which of course it couldn't even before the Dickey Amendment. But essentially what this did, this was a threat to the CDC that they better not fund any more firearm research. Since 1996, the CDC has not funded any more firearm research. Spoken to a couple of the directors of the National Center for Injury Prevention there. They can't even use the word gun in the building. They can't use that. So the CDC, our nation's prevention agency, for the last 22 years has not funded any firearm research. It turns out there's even a clause in the 900-page Accountable Care Act, protection of Second Amendment rights, which forbids collection of data about gun ownership as part of your patient right protection. It was put in by Harry Reid in Nevada. As a researcher, I'm prevented from getting access to a lot of data. In 1986, this Firearms Owners Protection Act banned, the federal act banned any federal registry of guns. The Dickey Amendment banned research. The Tiahrt Amendment banned the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms from releasing firearm trace data to researchers. So there's real restrictions on what we can and can't do. I'm going to end with what can you do as a member of your community. I think first we need to be asking patients and families about guns in the home. In polls about patients, the vast majority of patients think it's fine for you to ask about guns. The First Amendment gives you the right to ask about guns. We need to promote safe storage of firearms. We need to promote safe storage of firearms. We need to counsel patients and families about domestic violence protection orders and extreme risk protection orders. So domestic violence protection orders, they're probably the single best thing we have to prevent repeated episodes of domestic violence. And as part of that, I know in the state of Washington, there's a checkbox there about whether or not the assailant has a gun. How many of us with domestic violence are actually urging the woman to take out a protection order? It's not orders. This was passed in the state of Washington. I think 6 states now have them. It's basically where a family can go to a judge and say, my husband is mentally ill. He has a bunch of firearms. I think that it's unsafe for him to have access to those guns while he's mentally ill. The judge can then ask that those firearms be removed from home, order them to be removed from home. In the state of Washington, The vast majority of these have been done at the instigation of the police, not the medical community. And I think that's a failure on the part of the medical community. Try not to base action on anecdote. The latest anecdote was last night in California. We get all riled up about these mass shootings. Obviously, they're tragedies. But don't forget that 38,000 people a year die from firearms in the United States, and 60% of those are suicides. We need to be supporting funding for firearm research. It's pretty darn hard to find firearm research. NIH for a while had an RFA out there which funded firearm research. That's expired. The CDC, unless the House, when it turns, provides funding for firearm research to the CDC, it still won't fund that. There are a few foundations which support firearm research, but not a lot. City of Seattle was the first jurisdiction in the United States actually to support firearm research that they did for us. I think we should be informed. We need to know the data and be informed. And then finally, I think we as pediatricians need to do what we've always done, which is being advocates for kids. I'll lead you with this. Thank you very much. Good.